In his first sermon, the Buddha really covers everything that is essential about his teaching. Everything that he said later in his ministry is contained within this first sermon. And the first sermon revolves around what we call the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is the truth of Dukkha. This word Dukkha does not have an exact translation in English. Some people have translated it as suffering, but it doesn't really cover the whole range of the word dukkha. Yes, it is suffering, as we have it in English. Suffering, physical suffering when you get sick, when you get hurt, mental suffering of mental pain and anguish, mental disturbances. But it's also much more subtle than that. And the minor frustrations which we experience in our daily life, the moments of dissatisfaction, the irksome routine, the feeling sometimes I'm not very satisfied with this. All of these things are part of dukkha. And in this first sermon, the Buddha gives us three kinds of dukkha. He talks about dukkha, which is plain, straightforward suffering as we understand the English word. Sickness, old age, death, pain, sorrow, woe, lamentation, grief, despair. That is one form. Second form of dukkha is called viparinama dukkha, the suffering caused by change. One of the hallmarks of the Buddha's teaching is that everything is impermanent. There's nothing within us or outside us that you can look around and see which is permanent. Everything is changing. Some things change very rapidly. A bubble of soap suds lasts just a second or two. Granite lasts much longer, but sooner or later it will decay. There's nothing that is not subject to this law of impermanence. That by itself is not a problem. The problem arises because we want to try to make things permanent. We find something that we think is a source of happiness for us, that we like, that we enjoy, and we want it to last forever. That is the problem. That when it changes, as it will sooner or later, then we feel unhappy. We were attached to something, maybe something trivial, but it may also be something major, and when it changes, then there can be all sorts of problems. So we may think that, if only I had the right job, I would be truly happy. And maybe you eventually get what you think is the right job, and then the next week the company goes bust. And so there's grief and unhappiness because of that. Even friendships and relationships, they will eventually be broken, at least by one party dying. But they may also break up earlier than that. So what the Buddha was saying is that you cannot find permanent, lasting happiness from impermanent things. And that does not mean that we cannot enjoy impermanent things, but acknowledge that they are going to change sooner or later. So enjoy something that you have now, but don't be shocked, don't be disappointed when change happens. It will happen. So be realistic in your expectations. Don't go looking for permanent happiness from impermanent causes. Then the third form of dukkha is called sankhara dukkha, the suffering of what we call conditioned states. And I don't know if everybody has now this little chart of headed Samsara. Anybody not got it from last week? This is how the Buddha analyzed ourself. And on one level, there's a breakdown between physical and mental. Rupa, the physical; nama, the mental. And then the next level, there's still rupa, but now the mental side is divided into sensation, perception, predispositions or mental forces, and consciousness. These five are what he called the five Khandha. You will find that word on the left-hand side of the page. The five aggregates. This is how he defines a human being. We are a combination of these five Khandhas, which are mental and physical forces. Rupa is the physical side, which is broken down, in fact, into, first of all, 4 primary elements, and then another 24 secondary elements. So yes, there are 28 kinds of rupa. We don't need to concern ourselves with the great details there. But then the mental side is divided into sensation, which is what arises when one of your senses comes into contact with its appropriate object. So you can get you put your hand on something very hot, you get an unpleasant sensation. You put a piece of delicious food in your mouth, you get a very pleasant sensation. Then there's sanya, or perception, the process of knowing things, perceiving things. Then there are another 50 qualities which can arise in the mind. Things like greed, hatred, ignorance, goodwill, unselfishness, kindness, compassion. Things like concentration, attention. All of these are put under the heading of sankhara. And then finally, there is consciousness, vijnana, which is the receptacle for vedana, sanya, and sankhara. Consciousness only arises when a process of perception has taken place, or is taking place. Consciousness is not something that is always present, unchanging. It arises when, for example, your eye comes into contact with a visible object. And that sets in motion a process, and you can identify what it is you are seeing. That we call visual consciousness. And so with the other senses as well: auditory consciousness, tactile, ideational, olfactory. All senses have a corresponding consciousness. But there's no arising of consciousness without one of these senses being involved. I think the analogy I gave you last week is that fire cannot be just simple, plain fire. It has to be in association with wood, coal, gas, petrol, some other thing has to be present. You cannot have fire just by itself. And similarly, you can't have just consciousness all by itself. Now these 5 aggregates, we grasp at the aggregates. If you look at the Buddha's first sermon, on the right-hand page, page 93, the second paragraph, the last clause is, in brief, the 5 aggregates of attachment are suffering. The 5 Khandhas. It's not the Khandhas themselves which are the problem, it is the act of grasping or being attached to them. Because we invest these 5 qualities with the notion of I am this, or this is mine, this belongs to me, or this is myself. The Pali words are tanha, mana and ditthi. Because we make these 3 mistaken attempts to grasp at the aggregates, that gives rise to dukkha. We think, wrongly, that we are solidly existing persons. But the Buddha's analysis is that we are simply a process. We are an event. We're not something static. He said that human life is like a river. It flows on and on and on. It's never static, never unchanging. It's always moving, moving, moving. But we try to grasp onto this and make it something static, solid, and enduring. We can't do that, but we think we can. So the definition of an individual is, I think, very, very well expressed in Dr. Rahula's book, where in his book about what the Buddha taught. And he says there, what we call I, or being, is only a combination of physical and mental aggregates, Khandhas, which are working together interdependently in a flux of momentary change, that's impermanence, within the law of cause and effect. And there is nothing permanent, everlasting, unchanging, and eternal in the whole of existence. So this is a very different view from the view that most of us in the West have of an individual. We like to think generally that here's me. This is I know who I am. I mean, here's me. I definitely exist. But this is an alternative view of things, that actually we're nothing more, nothing less, but we are a process which is moving on and moving on and moving on and moving on. From moment to moment, these aggregates arise and pass away. And from moment to moment, new aggregates arise and pass away. But you can't hold on to anywhere and say that's static, that's solid, that's unchanging. You're all looking suitably puzzled by that. Does it make any sense?
Yes.
And if you want to ask some question about that, please do. It's a very different way of looking at the definition of an individual. We tend to think that something like the consciousness always exists, like this board always exists, and then experience is like writing on the board. Certain experiences are marked onto the consciousness. But that is not the Buddhist explanation. The consciousness only arises when one of these senses is stimulated, and then you get your visual or auditory or gustatory consciousness arising. And when that process has finished, another consciousness can arise. So you can only have one object in the mind at any one time. You may think that you see something and you hear something simultaneously. In fact, you don't. There's a moment of visual consciousness followed very, very rapidly by a moment of auditory consciousness, then another moment of visual consciousness, another moment of auditory consciousness. These processes, let's say millions, take place in a split second. So it's far too rapid for us to break down and see. You have to have the mind of somebody like the Buddha to be able to do that. So the summary that the Buddha gives us of his definition of dukkha is also in that same second paragraph, the penultimate clause. Not to get what one wants is suffering. So every time you fail to get what you want, that is a kind of dukkha. And that covers a whole huge range of different experiences. It covers the big problems like having nowhere suitable to live, or not getting better from some serious illness, down to the minor frustrations like you will get up in the morning and you can't find where you put your socks. Minor things. That may not be suffering as the English word suffering means, but it is still dukkha. So dukkha is the universal experience. Note how this is phrased. The noble truth of suffering is this. He's not saying you are suffering and you are suffering or you are suffering. He's saying this is the truth. Suffering exists. It's not personalized. It's a universal experience. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter how much money you have or power you have or anything else. You are still caught up in dukkha.
Is that the same as suffering is universal?
Yes, suffering is universal. Some forms of suffering you can avoid if you have sufficient money. You won't starve. You may be able to afford expensive medical treatments to deal with various illnesses. Certainly today, the average man is living at a much higher level than he did 2,500 years ago in India. But dukkha is still just as present today as it was then, because we still have old age, sickness, death, and we still fail to get what we want. So that is why the Buddha's teaching is as valid today as it was then. Then the Buddha went on in the second noble truth to give us the cause of suffering. The cause of suffering is what he calls thirst or craving. The word is tanha. Tanha comes in three kinds. The first is the craving, the thirst for sense pleasures. Each of our senses wishes to experience pleasure. You want to see pleasant things. You don't want to see ugly things. You want to smell pleasant smells. You don't want to smell bad smells. So the senses are always in search of pleasurable sensations. And we go on and on and on, seeking out more and more and more pleasant sensations. But no matter how many pleasant sensations we manage to find, they're not permanent. This process, the Buddha said, it's like pouring water into the ocean. The ocean is never going to say, enough, I'm satisfied. Similarly, the senses. Okay, you can perhaps satisfy one sense that you've eaten enough food and you think, oh, couldn't eat another thing. And then someone says, oh, but would you like a cup of coffee? Oh, yes, thank you very much. Would you like somewhere nice, comfortable to sit down now? Oh, yes, please. This is going on and on and on and on. So this is one form of craving, the craving for sense pleasures. It's also the desire not just for material things. Mind is also considered a sense. So we want to think pleasant or happy thoughts. We want to experience pleasant things in the mind, like fame, power, love. The second form of craving is called bhava tanha. Bhava means to become or to continue. We have a craving or a desire for our life to continue. If you were told that you won't be going home tonight because your life is going to come to a halt, I guess you probably would not be happy. You like to think you're going to be able to survive long enough to go home. That's one form of bhava, to continue. It's also the craving or the desire to achieve or to change oneself, and hopefully, after death, to continue on to another state. In some religions, they talk about the state of heaven. And so there's desire that I shall die and go to heaven. There's also the desire to continue in the sense of reproduction. This is what drives forward the whole of the natural world. Each species wishes to continue its genes by starting a new generation. That is bhava. And the third form of craving is vibhava tanha, the craving not to go on, not to continue. That can lead, unfortunately, to people deciding that they wish to terminate their life because they are very unhappy. It also gives rise to the materialistic viewpoint that after death, I hope I don't go on. I hope nothing survives. Just material elements decay and that's the end. No more going on. The eternalist view is, yes, I want to continue, bhava tanha, I want to go on to some further state. But the opposite is vibhava tanha. The hope that nothing goes on, nothing continues. So we can summarize these first two truths by saying that dukkha is a universal experience, and it is caused by our desire to attain and to hold on to things which we think will be a source of happiness. Hello. Good evening. Wait a minute, Indy's going to give you a piece of paper. Wait a minute. Some of you may know the analogy of the monkey trap. You know the monkey trap? If you wish to catch a monkey, make a little box with slats on the side. You put a banana inside and you secure the box by tying it to something steady like a tree. The monkey comes along and he puts his hand through the gap between two of the slats, and he grasps the banana. Now he has a problem, because his fist is now too big to go through the gap between the slats. So he's held there, stuck. To get away, all he has to do is release his attachment, take his hand out. But he doesn't do that. In the same way, we are held to this world of dukkha by our attachments. We are responsible. We are trapping our own hand here. Now, the Buddha is sometimes likened to a doctor. And these Four Noble Truths are sometimes likened to visiting the doctor. You go to the doctor, he checks you over and he says, yeah, you are sick. That is the first noble truth. And then he tells you why you are sick. That is the second noble truth. Though so far this is not a pessimistic statement or an optimistic statement, it's just a pure statement of fact. And then he tells you, you can be cured. That is the third noble truth. And then in the fourth noble truth, he tells you, this is what you have to do to be cured. The doctor prescribes the medicine, but it is you who has to take it. The doctor cannot take the medicine for you. So we looked at the first two noble truths, which by themselves could be said to be gloomy, pessimistic, but they're realistic. And then in the second noble truths, we have the turning of the corner and the better news that we can be cured of this problem. So now we come to the third of these noble truths. And in this first sermon, he says, this is halfway down the page, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering is this: it is the complete cessation of that very thirst, giving it up, renouncing it, emancipating oneself from it, detaching oneself from it. So if the cause of dukkha is tanha, if you remove the tanha, you've removed the cause. And you're left with the state that we call enlightenment. In the Sanskrit language, it is called nirvana, and in the Pali, it is Nibbana. I'm sure some of you have heard of this word. It was already known before the time of the Buddha as a description of a state of great happiness, but it wasn't defined as the Buddha defined it. The problem is, in fact, how do you define Nibbana? It's a state which is beyond our own experience. In fact, it's, until you attain it, it's beyond anyone's experience. And it's very difficult to describe this to someone who's never experienced it. Imagine you have never tasted sugar, and I want to give you an explanation. What does sugar taste like? I could talk to you for a year, and you still would have no idea what sugar tastes like. Once you get it on your tongue, and you experience it for yourself, now you know what sugar tastes like. But no amount of description is going to lead you there. And so, similarly, this state of Nibbana is not easy to define because it is beyond our day-to-day experience. Perhaps you know the story of the king and the blind men. A king has some blind men brought into the presence of an elephant. And he says to them, I want each of you to tell me, what is this? One man puts out his hand, he touches the leg and says, oh, this is a pillar. Another one touches the ear and says, this is a fan. Another one touches the tusk and says, this is a plough. Another one touches the tail, which has a lot of hairs growing in the tip. This is a broom. Then the arguments start. Each man argues that he is right. He says, I know it, I know I am right because I have grasped it. And I think this is an analogy for a lot of religious disagreement. We may think we and we alone have grasped the truth, and other teachings are therefore wrong. But it may be we have in fact grasped only a part of the truth, and other teachings have also grasped a part of the truth. No one has got hold of the whole of the truth. When the Buddha taught, he said, he didn't say he taught Buddhism. He just said he taught the truth. Truth cannot be sectarian. Either something's true or it's not true. If it's true for everybody. It doesn't matter whether you call yourself a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Christian or anything else. Either something is true or it's not true. And the Buddha said what he taught was the truth.
Is that what Dhamma is?
That's a good question. Dhamma is one of these words which has several different meanings. It can indeed refer to the truth. It can refer to the Buddha's teachings, because he didn't differentiate between the truth and his teachings. It can also refer to the, how can we say, the building blocks of existence, which is a very different meaning. But generally, yes, you can say that Dhamma, or in Sanskrit Dharma, is the Buddha's teachings. So it is easier to say what Nibbana is not. It's easier to ascribe the negatives to it. You can say it is the end of certain things. It is the end of suffering, the cessation of suffering, the end of three root defilements that we all have in our minds. They are lobha, dosa, and moha. All other negative states of mind are a mixture of these three. They are the three primary roots. You can think of them perhaps a little bit like primary colours. You mix the primary colours together and you can get any other colour. You mix these roots together, you get any other defilement in the mind. Lobha is attachment. It's like tanha. Greed, wanting, desire. Dosa is the opposite. Want to get rid of, meaning hatred, dislike, anger. Moha is ignorance, non-understanding, the lack of wisdom. You can have moha just by itself, pure ignorance. But lobha must also have moha. If there was no ignorance, there would be no lobha. Similarly, if there was no ignorance, there would be no dosa. Dosa and lobha are mutually exclusive. One is attraction, the other is aversion. So you can't have them at the same time. You have one or the other. But they both have to be accompanied by ignorance or non-understanding. So the state of Nibbana is the eradication of lobha and dosa and moha. Eradication is permanent. There's no backsliding. They cannot come back. Once you've got rid of them, that is finish. We can also say that Nibbana is the eradication of the asava, the special knowledge that the Buddha attained at the end of the third watch of the night when he reached enlightenment, and which marked his attainment of enlightenment, was the knowledge of the eradication of the asava. We can call them corruptions or defilements. There are 4 of them. There's the defilement of sense desire, which is already covered. There's the corruption of bhava, becoming, which we've also covered. And there's the corruption of wrong view, ditthi, wrong understanding of the way things are. In particular, the ascribing of some quality of permanence to ourself. And then fourthly, the corruption of avidya, which is another word for moha, for ignorance. So we can say that Nibbana is the eradication of these 4 asavas. There are also 2 other terms that we can use. The first is asamkata. That means not conditioned, not compounded. This is actually a very important point. Before I ever got interested in Buddhism, the idea of things arising due to a cause was Well, it's something I sort of vaguely knew about, but I didn't give it much thought, but it's very important. Everything within us and around us is a result of a preceding event. Something causes. This piece of paper has not always existed. It had to be formed by a process in a factory, and that factory had to use various materials. Other materials were needed to make the factory. There needed to be people in there to operate the factory. We needed maybe electricity or something, or some form of power. That's got to be made and transferred to the factory. So everything is subject to causation, except the state of Nibbana. Because it is not subject to causation, it is permanent. The Buddha's last recorded words were, "Impermanent are all conditioned things. Work out your own salvation with diligence." Impermanent are all conditioned things. And the exception here is the state of Nibbana. Because it's not conditioned, it is permanent. Does that make any sense? Okay. So that's one thing you can say about Nibbana. It is asamkata, not caused. The other thing you can say is it is anidasanang, without characteristics. As soon as you ascribe a characteristic to something, you are limiting it. If you say something is very big, there is nevertheless a limit to it. If something is very small, there's also a limit to that. But Nibbana has no limitations. And we cannot ascribe to it characteristics. There was a very highly esteemed monk, Dr. Rahula, whom I mentioned earlier. He wrote the book, What the Buddha Taught. Sadly, he died about 20 years ago. But I remember him talking here one evening, and he said he had been asked to sit on a panel of so-called religious experts from various different religions. He was there as the Buddhist representative. And there was a discussion taking place, and they were taking questions from the audience. And one question came up: what is God? And the chairman steered that question to a Christian priest. So the Christian priest stood up to answer the question. As he was standing up, Dr. Rahula said to him, "Excuse me. Anything you say about God must be wrong." Again, you cannot ascribe qualities to an unlimited characteristic. So we do have a problem to describe Nibbana in any way that is really meaningful to us. It's beyond our own experience. We can take it on the word of the Buddha, and we can take it on the word of various followers of his who have attained enlightenment, both at his time and subsequently, that it is a highly the Buddha called it is the highest happiness. That means there is also happiness in other areas. The Buddha didn't deny that there is happiness, but Nibbana is the highest. So we do have happiness in the everyday world, but the happiness of the everyday world is limited. It's impermanent, it's conditional, and cannot be relied upon. We could say that, first of all, Nibbana is a kind of realization. It is a realization sometimes likened to awakening from a dream. Normally we don't see things correctly. We see things as if we're in a dream. But the state of Nibbana means that we can understand things properly. Understand what? Understand the Four Noble Truths. To begin with, you can read about the Four Noble Truths, you can discuss the Four Noble Truths, and you get a kind of intellectual understanding. But when you really experience these truths, that is a state of realization. And it leads, of course, to the dropping of all attachment to sense objects, to the sensory world. It doesn't mean to say you can't experience happiness from the sensory world, but you're not attached to it at all. And the Buddha often spoke about the pleasures, the delights of living in the forest. He obviously enjoyed that, but he wasn't attached to it. That's where the grasping comes in, that we are tied up with. It's also a state of liberation. It is the liberation from these qualities of lobha, dosa, and moha. It's liberation from all negative states of mind, liberation from all states of misery and unhappiness and dissatisfaction. It is therefore a state of moral perfection, because the enlightened being can no longer perform any action which is in any way unwholesome or unskillful. You can use the word bad or evil. It can't perform any action which causes suffering to others. So it is the state of pure happiness. And it was attained by the Buddha at the age of 35, after his time spent with these teachers, Alarika Lama and Uddaka Ramaputta, and then he went to spend time with these ascetics. And then he struck off by himself and he reached enlightenment. That was the age of 35. And then he continued to live until the age of 80. So we can say that there are two I don't want to say levels, two aspects perhaps of Nibbana. There's the aspect of Nibbana which relates to the attainment in this life. Unlike some religions which teach that you die and then you may go to heaven, in Buddhism, Nibbana has to be attained while you are alive. So if you want to know for sure whether it exists or not, you can attain it here and now. You don't have to wait until you die to find out whether Nibbana is true or not. So that is the first stage, or the first realization, that Nibbana exists. And we can say that is Nibbana with the five aggregates, the five Khandhas, which the Buddha used to describe an individual. Those five Khandhas are still in existence. So this can be attained while the individual is alive. It's a mental attainment, a mental achievement, so there will be no difference externally. You can't tell from someone's body whether that person is enlightened or not. And all the disciples of the Buddha who attained enlightenment while they were alive. But eventually, human bodies have to die. They decay, they get sick, and they die. The body of the Buddha was no exception, and that of any other enlightened being is not exception either. That is the nature of the body. So then, if you like, the second aspect of Nibbana is found, which is Nibbana without the 5 aggregates. Sometimes that is called Pari-Nibbana, P-A-R-I, Pari-Nibbana. And that was the state which the Buddha attained at the age of 80 when his body died. So then the question is, so where does he go? The Buddha's answer to this was to say, suppose there is a lamp and it is burning, oil lamp is burning, but eventually the flame goes out, either because the wick is exhausted, or the oil is exhausted, or they both are exhausted at the same time, or maybe a gust of wind comes along and blows the flame out. Can you now say where that flame has gone to? Has it gone to the north, or the south, or the east, or the west? No. All you can say is the conditions which had been in existence, which had maintained that flame, those conditions have now changed, but we can't say where the flame has gone to. So that's why we can't say where the Buddha goes to after death. There were 10 questions which the Buddha refused to answer. One day one of his monks, Malunkyaputta, came to see him and said, "Sir, I want an answer to these 10 questions, otherwise I'm not going to continue with the monastic life." He said, is the world eternal? Or is the world not eternal? Is the world finite? Is the world not finite? Are the spirit and the body the same? Or are the spirit and the body separate? That's 6. And the last 4 relate to the term used there was Tathagata, which is the word that the Buddha used always to refer to himself. Does the Tathagata exist after death? That's question 7. Question 8. Does the Tathagata not exist after death? Does the Tathagata both exist and not exist after death? Does the Tathagata both not exist after death and not exist after death? And the Buddha said, something like, "You are a foolish man. You've never heard me answer these questions, and you never will hear me answering these questions, because you don't need to know the answers." He gave a very famous analogy of the man shot in the arm by a poisoned arrow. Does anybody not know this little story? Okay. A man is shot in the arm by a poisoned arrow. His friends want to pull the arrow out. And the man says, no, wait, hold, stop. First of all, I want to know who shot this arrow. What was his name? What was his family? What was his village? And who made the arrow? What was his name, his family, and his village? And the bow. Who made the bow? And what kind of wood was used for the bow? And what kind of stringing was used for the string of the bow? And he goes asking all these questions, and the blood, his poison enters the bloodstream, and he dies. The Buddha is making the point. We have an urgent problem. The urgent problem is we are mired in this existence of dukkha. Put all your energy, all your effort into getting out of this mess, getting out of dukkha, eradicating dukkha. Don't waste your time and energy on unnecessary investigations. So his teaching is a very focused teaching. He said, I teach just dukkha and the ending of dukkha. Or in another place he said, just as the mighty ocean has the taste of salt, meaning wherever you take water out of the ocean, it's got the same salty taste, so has this mighty Dhamma but one taste, the taste of deliverance. So the Buddha didn't want to get involved in a lot of what he thought were unnecessary, irrelevant questions. If your house is burning down, you don't need to know who designed it and who built it and all sorts of other things. That's unnecessary. Just get the fire brigade in, put the fire out. So his teaching is very much focused on dukkha and the ending of dukkha. It may well be that he knew a lot more than he taught us. One day he was walking through a forest with a party of his monks, and he picked up from the floor of the forest a handful of leaves. And he said, monks, which is greater, the quantity of leaves I have here in my hand, or the leaves on the trees above our heads? And they said, oh, sir, the number of leaves in your hand are very few. The number of leaves on the trees above our heads are very many. And the Buddha said, yes, just so. What I have taught you is like the leaves here in my hand. What I know is like the leaves on the trees above our heads. Meaning, he knew an awful lot more, but he didn't teach it. But what have I taught you? I've taught you. This is the noble truth of dukkha. This is the noble truth of the cause of dukkha. This is the noble truth of the cessation of dukkha, and this is the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. So, apart from that, he's not interested to explain to us all sorts of wonderful things about where the world came from and where the world is going to and the origin of X, Y, and Z and so on and so forth. Quite unimportant from Buddha's point of view. So he's focused very much on this dukkha and its eradication. There are 31 realms of existence, divided into 3 divisions. Starting at the bottom, the lower page, you have 11 sense sphere planes. Above that, page 186, you have 16 fine material sense planes, and above that 4 immaterial sense planes. Beings can take rebirth in any of these planes. And some of them are very, very, very long. The lifespans you'll find on the right side of the page. What controls the place of the new birth is the quality that we call Kamma, actions. Depending on how you have performed various actions in your preceding life or lives, the dominant quality of the Kamma, which is dominant at the time of death, will condition the next life in one of these planes. So numbers 1 to 4 are planes called woeful planes, planes of suffering, places of unhappiness. You can call them hell. Above that, there is a human plane. And then numbers 6 to 11 go by the description of sensuous, blissful plane. Those are various kinds of gods. Those planes are what we can call heavenly planes. But you cannot equate that to, say, the Christian concept of heaven. First, the beings in those planes are not there eternally. You can see the lifespan on the right side of the page. So you're not in an eternal heaven. And when life comes to an end in that particular plane, then there'll be a rebirth, which will be controlled by Kamma. And there may be something which surfaces from several lives before, which was a negative thing. So you could go down to one of the woeful planes. This is not, you're not always going up, non-stop. You're going up and down according to your Kamma. So that's why we can't call that a heaven equivalent to, say, a Christian heaven. Secondly, these beings in these heavenly planes, you can call them gods, they have no power to influence or to control the lives of others. So you cannot worship or pray to one of these heavenly beings and ask for guidance and help and so forth. So there is no supreme, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving deity in this scheme of things. So when we talk about a heaven, you're talking about a being going to an existence which is very pleasant, but not eternal. And he is just as much a part of, this is what we call samsara. Samsara, this cycling around from one life to another life, to another life, to another life, to another life. The Buddha said even he couldn't see back to the beginning of samsara. And that means beings in these heavenly states will also experience existence in these other states as well. So does that answer your question? Has that dealt with the question or not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually our afterlife feeds itself from our present life.
Sorry, say again?
Our afterlife feeds itself from our present life.
Yes. But afterlife is not a permanent state. It's of limited length, and after that there'll be another birth, and another death, and another birth, and another death, and another birth, and another death. The immensity of samsara is beyond our ability to comprehend. It is so vast. One analogy the Buddha gave was, suppose you take all the twigs, little bits of wood, you can find in India, and you put one down and say, this is my mother. Next one, this is my mother's mother. This is the mother of my mother's mother. This is the mother of my mother's mother's mother, and so on and so on. He said, you will use up all the twigs in India before you come to an end of this man's mother's 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 mother. It's just a way of trying to help us to realize this is so vast.
So to come into the hell realm, what would we come back as an animal?
You could come back either as into a hell realm, or as an animal, or as a peta, which is a hungry ghost, or as an asura.
So what would you have to do? Say like the guy shooting the MP for argument's sake.
Yeah.
Qualify?
Probably. Yeah. Any act of killing is likely to result in an unhappy rebirth. But you also have to take into consideration the whole picture. And the Buddha explained this by saying, if you take a lump of salt and you put it into a cup of water, that salt will be so strong that the water becomes undrinkable. If you take the same lump of salt and put it into the river Ganges, it will be so heavily diluted as to be undetectable. If your unskillful actions are like the lump of salt, and your skillful actions are only as big as a cup of water, then the effect of these unskillful actions will certainly manifest. If your skillful actions are as vast as the river Ganges, and you put your unskillful actions there, they will be so diluted by the huge number of skillful actions you've performed that the Kamma may not take any effect at all. The Asuras are said to actually have not a bad time, but they are consumed with jealousy. They're jealous of the beings in the heavenly planes. And so because of that, they are in a state of misery and unhappiness.
What about the hungry ghosts?
Yep. Well, they are portrayed as beings with huge bellies and very, very, very thin necks. So they cannot fill their bellies. They can't get the food and the liquid needed to fill their bellies. Whether there really is a hungry ghost around here at the moment, I don't know. You can see first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. And if you are skilled at attaining these states, when you die, you may be reborn into one of these jhana planes. In which case you are headed for a very long and very pleasant existence. But the Buddha never recommended one should try for rebirth in one of these very high planes. He talked about the human plane as being a very special plane. The human plane is a mixture of happiness and unhappiness. It's like the carrot and the stick. We know happiness and we want more happiness. And we really want to attain permanent happiness. So that is the incentive, work towards the attainment of Nibbana. But also in the human plane, we experience unhappiness. And that is the stick. We want to get away from the unhappiness. If you're born in one of these very high planes, life is just too nice, too enjoyable. You don't want to do anything else. Just, take it easy. Chill out, as the expression is. Just enjoy the existence there. You're not doing anything to condition for yourself a future birth in a happy state. You're like a being living, like a human being, living off his capital. He has no income, but he's living just from accumulated capital, and every year that capital goes down till eventually it's used up. If you're born in one of these very unhappy planes, very difficult to get out of them. Very difficult to do something which is going to help you to achieve a better birth in your next life. But in the human plane, not only do we know both happiness and unhappiness, we also have the possibility of, first of all, hearing the Buddha's teachings, and secondly, practicing the Buddha's teachings and benefiting from his teachings. And it is from the human plane that the state of enlightenment is to be attained. You don't attain enlightenment from these other planes. With one exception, which I'll come to in just a moment. So, why are we not all enlightened? It's a little problem. What we call fetters. 10 fetters. And I hope you all have this chart. Anybody not got the chart of 10 fetters? Okay. Number 1. Sakkaya ditthi. Ditthi is a view or a belief. Sakkaya is the personality belief or the self-belief, the self-delusion. The delusion that we are solid, existing beings. As I mentioned earlier, we're not. We are only this flowing on of the aggregates arising and passing away from moment to moment. And because we have this self-delusion, other problems follow from that. We feel we have to protect the self. We get upset when someone insults us or says something nasty to us. We get hurt. We want to also boost up our self. We want to attain fame and power. All sorts of things that enhance our concept of self. And it is this which lies at the root of many, many, many of our problems. This notion of a solidly existing self which has to be enhanced, protected, cajoled, looked after, pandered to. So this is the first of the fetters, because it is so fundamental to our concept of what we are. We won't be able to eliminate that absolutely and completely until enlightenment is attained. But we can at least have some elementary understanding that what we are composed of are these 5 Khandhas, the 5 grasping groups, all of which are in a state of change, all of which are in a state of flux. So that is a fetter. As long as we believe we have to look after this self and pander to it and protect it, this is what leads to conceit, to arrogance, to pride. So it's a very, very dangerous concept, and we all suffer from it. The second fetter, vicikicca, skeptical doubt. For example, what was I in the past? What shall I be in the future? Where did I come from? Where am I going to? The Buddha encouraged investigative doubt. Investigative doubt is where you have a question about something, you dig in, you investigate, you find the answer, you've widened your understanding, and that's helpful, that's good. When you ask a question and you get an answer to your question, that increases your understanding. That's fine. But this skeptical doubt, this relates to questions which you can't answer, but you keep asking them. The Buddha likened this to being lost in a desert without a map. You don't know, shall I go this way or this way, or I don't know, what about this way? You don't know where to go. So many questions. Which way shall I go? But you can't find an answer to your question, but you keep asking the questions. The antidote to this is the development of a quality which is called saddha, S-A-D-D-H-A, saddha. Saddha is sometimes translated as faith, but we do not recognize something which is generally called blind faith. Blind faith is when you believe in something even though you don't have any particular reason to believe it. You just accept it. Saddha is usually translated better as confidence based on knowledge. When you have a knowledge about something, then you develop confidence in it. If we could know what goes on in the mind of a hen sitting on her eggs, we should know that she's not just sitting there thinking, well, I hope something happens. Maybe, I'm going to sit here for a few days. Maybe something will happen. No, she understands. Providing she maintains these eggs at the right temperature for the right amount of time, there's going to be a hatching of eggs and chicks are going to appear. So, although those eggs haven't yet hatched out, she is confident that they will do, because she knows what is necessary. So, if you take the Buddhist path as a set of maybe instructions, if you ask somebody for instructions, how do I get from here to Hammersmith? And you're told, well, go out of the Vihara, turn to your right, walk along 100 yards, there's a mini roundabout, and then another 100 yards you'll find the tube station on the left, and go on up to the end of the road, you'll find Barclays Bank in front of you. At those traffic lights, turn to your left. You've got some instructions. To begin with, you don't know for sure whether these instructions are any good or not, but you start. And as you progress, your experience bears out what the instructions told you. Oh yes, there's the mini roundabout. There's Turning Green Tube Station. There's Barclays Bank. So now you begin to develop confidence. You haven't yet got to Hammersmith, but you have the confidence that these instructions are going to help you get to Hammersmith. So far, your experience has confirmed that these instructions are accurate. So now you're developing confidence. That is what we will call faith, saddha. The third fetter, silabata paramasa, the adherence to wrongful rites and rituals and ceremonies, believing that there is something inherent in the particular ritual which has some power. I've already mentioned that at that time the Brahmin priests were extremely powerful because they had the monopoly on the performance of sacrificial rituals. And these rituals were supposed to be very, very powerful. In fact, they didn't always work. People got sick, rain never came, crops withered up, all sorts of problems developed. We shouldn't believe that the mere performance of a ritual has some kind of special power. Some people say that in order to purify yourself, you should take a bath, a purificatory bath. And the Buddha said, if washing alone could make us pure, then the purest beings must be fish. So again, he's saying, look, don't go and spend your time washing yourself and believing that you are having some kind of purificatory rite here. So he was trying to get people away from superstition, from empty belief, from the idea that some practices will be of use, will be of help. He said, if you want to cross a river, there's no point in performing some ritual. Either build a bridge or build a boat, but don't mess around on the bank with some kind of special ceremonials. But as long as we persist in this belief, then, of course, this is a fetter. This is going to stop us making progress. Number 4, karma raga. Karma. We've had this with karma tanha, the desire for sense pleasures. Raga is a synonym for tanha. So this is the desire for sense pleasures. The Buddha said that our natural inclination is to seek out sense pleasures. But he also said, it is like a thirsty man drinking salt water. The sense pleasures that we get do not satisfy our desires. We always want some additional sense pleasure. We always want more, in the mistaken belief that providing we keep on getting sense pleasures, we're going to have happiness. Well, if you really could live your life in such a way that you were always getting some pleasurable stimulus, you might achieve a state of happiness, but a rather precarious state. So this attachment to sense pleasures is at the heart of the second noble truth. So that again is a fetter, holds us back. Then we have vyapada, ill will or anger. This is a similar word as patiga. It means to hit against. So we come into either mental, verbal or physical conflict with others. This can be on an individual basis, it can be on a national basis, but it is all a form of anger or hatred or ill will. Now the sixth fetter is called rupa raga, and the seventh is arupa raga. To explain that, would you please look at your chart of the 31 realms of existence. Now we have rupa raga and arupa raga. So raga is a desire, and the terms rupa and arupa we had with the 5 aggregates. The first aggregate was rupa, material form. And so there are certain planes of rupa, of material form. And those, if you look at your chart of the 31, are the 16 in the top page called fine material sphere plane. We can call those the rupa planes. And above them are the immaterial sphere planes, not material. And in the Pali language, you can make a negative by putting the letter A in front of it. So rupa becomes arupa, no rupa, not material. So with fetter number 6, you have a wish, a desire to be reborn in one of these 16 fine material sphere planes. That's numbers 12 up to 27. And the arupa raga is the desire for rebirth in one of these immaterial sphere planes, numbers 28 to 31. You might think, yeah, I've got a lot of problems in this world, but it would be really nice to spend a few great eons enjoying myself in one of these high planes. But as I said a moment ago, the Buddha never recommended that we should strive for rebirth in any of these higher planes, because they're not going to help us to attain Nibbana. That's why the human plane is such an important plane. So if you want to attain birth in one of these rupa or arupa planes, then you're still not going to escape from the state of samsara, this cycling along of birth, death, birth, death, birth, death, going on and on and on and on and on. You'll still be tying yourself to samsara. So that is why the Buddha said that both of these, rupa raga and arupa raga, would be, or are, a form of fetter. Number 8 is mana, usually translated as conceit. And I think we all know what we mean by conceit, by pride, arrogance. But the literal meaning of the word mana is measuring. And yes, if you measure yourself against others and decide, yeah, I'm superior to all these people, I'm better than they are, that is conceit. But if you measure yourself and consider that you are inferior, I'm worse than, I'm just a miserable worm in comparison with X, Y, or Z. That is also mana. It's also a form of measuring. So the first form was what we might call the superiority complex. The second kind is the inferiority complex. That's also a form of measuring. And indeed, even to measure and conclude, I'm the equal, I'm as good as he is, I've got as good a car as he has, or I've got as well paid a job as he has, or that is also measuring. Yes, we are all different. We're not the same, we are different. We can recognize that we're different, but don't draw from that a conclusion that you are either better or worse, higher or lower. Just acknowledge there are differences. But to go around comparing yourself with others is not skillful, not helpful, not beneficial. I mean, even in the spiritual world we have conceit. The sanctimonious person who thinks he's very holy. How long do you spend meditating each day? Oh, only 20 minutes. Oh, I sit for an hour every day. Or, you only keep 5 precepts? I keep 8 precepts. So there's room even in the spiritual life that you can get conceited. Then the next fetter is uddhacca. This is a state of the mind where it is continuously disturbed, distracted, restless, excited. There's no tranquility, there's no peace in the mind, always agitation. We sometimes talk about the monkey mind. Because monkeys, you see them in the trees, They run up here, then they dash over there, then back here, up there, and down there, and along there. They're always charging around all over the place. That's like our minds. You spend a few minutes watching your mind. And then with one thought followed by another thought, followed by another thought, in all sorts of different directions and all sorts of different subjects. So the mind is very restless. It's very like the surface of water, disturbed by the wind, whipped up into agitation and restlessness. And then the last of these fetters is avidya, which is is negative, vidya is to see. We get the English word vision from the same root. Avidya, not seeing, or ignorance, also known as moha. It is ultimately not seeing the truth that is the cause of our journeying on in samsara, life after life after life. After life. Now the fetters are eliminated in stages. If you look on the left side of that page, you'll see 4 paths: Sotapanna, Sakadagami, Anagami, and Arahat. Arahat, or sometimes Arahant, A-N-T. Sotapanna, a stream enterer. He has entered the stream that leads to Nibbana. He's not reached Nibbana, but he has purified his mind of the first 3 fetters, Sakaya Ditti, Vicikicca, Silabbata Paramasa. Those fetters have been eradicated. They will not come back. He has purified his actions to such a degree that he will never be reborn in an unhappy state. And at most, he will be reborn 7 more times before enlightenment is reached. It's sometimes likened to walking in the foothills of a range of mountains. The top of the mountains has been covered up by cloud, but just for a moment, the cloud clears away, and you can get a glimpse of the top of the mountain. Even though the cloud comes back, you are now confident. This path is going to take me to the top of the mountain. No more doubting. You've seen the top, and you know you're on the right track. So similarly, you have now eliminated skeptical doubt. You are confident that you're on the right path. So you're a stream enterer, entering the stream which flows towards the state of Nibbana. So that is the first part of the, we sometimes call the stages of sainthood. I think that's probably a slight borrowing from the Western concept of a saint. But it is the beginning of, this is the first stage that you've reached. The Sakadagami is called a once returner because if he is not attaining enlightenment in this life, he will be reborn only once more. And the Sakadagami, he has reduced, not eliminated, but he has reduced fetters 4 and 5. So Kama, Raga and Vyapada are still there, but they're not as powerful as they were. And as a result, at the most 1 more birth after the present one. The anagami has eradicated numbers 4 and 5. So he is a non-returner. That means he will not return to the sensual planes. If he doesn't attain enlightenment in this life, then his next birth will be in what are called the pure abodes, which are numbers 23 to 27 on your chart. And then enlightenment is attained from there. If you look on the right side of the page, it says the 5 lower fetters bind to the Kamma loka. Loka is the plane. Kamma, the plane of the senses. That means they bind us to the first 11, the bottom 11 of these planes. Numbers 1 to 11 are the sense sphere planes. Whereas the higher fetters, 6 to 10, bind us to the higher worlds, the realms of form and the immaterial realms. So these next, or the final 5 fetters, are all eliminated, and that is marked by the attainment of arahat. That is an enlightened being. There are 3 kinds of enlightened being. There is the fully self-enlightened Buddha. That is the man whose teaching we are trying to follow or trying to learn about, Buddha Gautama. He did not have any teacher. He had to figure out for himself the path to enlightenment. And he left behind a body of teaching to guide others to enlightenment. That's the first kind of Buddha. The second is called a silent Buddha. The silent Buddha, just like the fully self-enlightened Buddha, has no teacher. But he is silent. He doesn't teach for the benefit of other beings. The third kind of enlightened being is called a Savaka Buddha or Arahant. The Arahant has to have the teaching of a fully self-enlightened being to help him, to guide him to the state of enlightenment. He cannot figure it out by himself. So all of the followers of the Buddha in the last 2,500 years who have attained enlightenment are all arahants. They followed the teaching which the fully self-enlightened Buddha gave them. In terms of enlightenment, the experience of enlightenment, all 3, the fully self-enlightened Buddha, the silent Buddha, and the Arahant, in terms of their experience of Nibbana, they're all the same. There's no different degrees of Nibbana. But it is whether or not they have a teacher, which makes them different, and whether they can figure things out for themselves, and whether they can teach others, leave behind them a body of doctrine which enables others to reach Nibbana. So we are fortunate that we are living in a time when the teaching of the fully self-enlightened Buddha is still available. And we're living in a part of the world where this is known. So we have a special opportunity to hear these teachings and to try to develop them, practice them, and benefit from them. Any questions?
How cumulative is this past lives? Because I was fascinated by some of my friends couldn't care less. Some people I know just naturally gravitated to, let's say, the spiritual world out of curiosity.
When you say cumulative, I mean, the more wholesome actions you do, the more powerful will be the force that tends towards future states of happiness. The more unskillful actions you perform, the greater will be the tendency to migrate to unhappy states of existence. But when we were having the tea break, I mentioned about the idea of the piece of salt and the dilution, whether you have a cup of water or you have the river the size of the Ganges. So once an action has been performed, you can never unperform it. But you can dilute its effects if you wish to do so. But we each of us arrive at the start of a new life with our own unique karmic inheritance. So we're all starting off this particular life at different stages, different levels of understanding.
That's what I mean, because I've heard in Buddhism, if someone says natural something, Tiger Woods for argument's sake, they may have done it in another life, some equivalent. But
that's possible. I mean, this is a slightly different subject, but yes, how do you explain what is generally called a genius? Some people say, well, that's a gift from God. But if you're not a great believer in an all-powerful God, how else do you explain that certain young children can display amazing qualities? As I said, everything is subject to causation, so you've got to try to find a cause for these things, and it may be that they're bringing with them into this life an ability that has been accumulated in previous lives. We won't be able to get onto this subject, but there is a subject called the 10 perfections, 10 qualities which this Buddha, Gautama Buddha, perfected in himself. And this took him an almost incalculable number of lifetimes. But in each life, he was working towards perfecting one of these 10 qualities. And then the next life, he'd go a little bit further forward. Next life, a little bit further forward. One life he might be perfecting perfection number 1. Next life it might be perfection number 2. But there was a cumulative effect. So when he was born as Prince Siddhartha, he had an accumulation of these perfections, which were then so highly developed that he could then reach the state of enlightenment. Did that answer your question?
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Anybody still awake? Okay, it's 9 o'clock. Time to go.